Good morning, good afternoon, possibly good evening, depending on where you might be. Hello again, I'm your host, Photo Joseph, and welcome to the DxO webinar where we are playing with the Nik Collection 4, specifically Silver Efex Pro, one of my personal favorite plugins. I have been using Silver Efex Pro for doing black and white work for, well, let's not talk about how long, because then you know how old I am. But I have been using it for a long time, and I absolutely adore it. It is and I could be a little bit biased here, but I do believe this is the absolute best tool for making black and white conversions on the market today. It just has so much capability. It's so deep. There's so much you can do with it. I've actually done, true story, I did an entire gallery show of black and white images that I shot on medium format Leica. This is a long time ago. Big digital, but big, huge medium format Leica. Did these massive 40 by 60 inch, I want to say, prints. A couple of them were even bigger because I had a couple that were like super wide. Anyway, big prints. All the treatment done in the Nik Collection, specifically in Silver Efex Pro, and it was that was fun. It was beautiful, and it really is just superb. I do want to point out that there is so much to this app that we're not going to get into today because it's just so deep. And today we're going to focus on some high-level stuff, but then get into what's specifically new. But of course, there's so much more than that to it. We're going to discover the 39 simulations. Okay, we're not actually going to look at all 39 of them, but the simulations perfectly match the black and white silver films, which were created using DxO's exclusive calibration system. So let me actually talk about that now, because it doesn't really fit into the demo, and I just want to make sure that you all understand just how good the simulations are. These grain simulations that we're going to see once we get into that part of the demo were actually recreated from scans, high resolution scans of actual film using all these different native films. So if you had, let's say, a T-Max 100, Kodak T-Max 100 black and white film, in negative was scanned, the grain was recreated from that, meant to mimic that look as precisely as possible. And that goes for all the different films. I just wanted to mention that now because I probably forget when we got there, but that's what makes them so good and so accurate. Now, we're also going to see the new interface for Silver Efex Pro 3. It's got a nice cleaned up interface. As it says here, we're going to make your black and white images stand out with the new ClearView tool, which is quite interesting because we're actually going to base today's demo all out of PhotoLab 4, which has its own ClearView tool. The ClearView tool that is in Silver Efex Pro is taken from there. And I'm going to show you, and we're going to talk about how I could do it in PhotoLab directly, but why you might want to wait until you get into Silver Efex Pro to do that. So we're going to cover all of that in today's presentation. So with all that said, let's just get into this thing. If you have questions throughout, by all means, drop them into the questions area. Someone is assisting me here in the chat who is going to extract those questions and aggregate them for me in a separate window. So we will take momentary breaks throughout the presentation today to do my best to answer your questions as we go. I'm also going to turn off my camera whenever we're doing the demo. I will try to remember to turn it on and off as we go to slides, but just to make a little bit more room on your screen to see all the good stuff. So let's just get rid of me. You don't need to see me anymore. And now let's get into the first photo. And the first photo is not this one there. Is actually going to be this one here. Now, here's kind of a fun thing to start with on this photo. This has been worked on quite a bit. I'm going to reset this. I want to show you where this image started. This is where the photo started. So this, I just hit the reset button. This is the original photo. You can see it's, let's not call it blown out or overexposed, but the sky is clearly very, very bright. And whenever I'm working with a raw photo like this, and I guess, to be fair, this could have been slightly darker for the original exposure because we do have a little bit of room here in the shadows, but there's no way this photo is going to be captured in a single frame within a standard kind of 8-bit working space. So we're going to need to do something to pull this sky back. Now, as I always point out before we go into any of the filters, and we're going to do this with all the photos we work with today, you want to do your raw adjustments before you get into the filter. And let's just talk about that for a moment of why this is so important. When you take your photo into the Nik Collection, whether you're coming from Photoshop or Lightroom or PhotoLab as we are today, or simply opening a photo from the desktop, from your Finder or from your Windows Explorer directly into the plugins, which is worth pointing out, you actually can do that. These plugins, we call them plugins, but they're really apps. They are standalone apps that you can run on their own, open a photo in them and do the work that you want to do to it, and then save out of there. All that's completely possible. Most people are using them within an app like PhotoLab 4 as we are here today. Now, the point that I want to make is that when you are starting from a raw file, you actually can't open a raw file in those apps. Those apps do not have their own raw decoder. So you're relying on the raw decoder of your host application, which is totally normal. This is how these things work. But this means that what we're going to send to any of the Nik collection filters will be a, let's call it a rendered image. It is a converted from raw to a TIFF file. And at that point, you lose your raw editing capabilities. So you lose a certain degree of highlight recovery. You lose a certain degree of white balance shifting. For example, you can shift white balance, kind of color tint an image, but true white balance adjustment happens at the raw level. And once you're no longer raw, you're not doing true white balance adjustment. So there are certain changes that you really want to make before you get into the plugin. You always want to send the best data possible to the plugin. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you want to get your highlights and shadows exactly the way that you want them for the final image. But what it does mean is that when we're looking at the histogram up here, so now I'll take your attention up to the top left. When you're looking at your histogram, you want to make sure you don't have something like this, where we are clipping out a huge portion of the image. There's a lot of data missing here. Now, if this was a JPEG, this data would be gone forever, but it's not. This is a raw file. And the way that I always like to start when I'm looking at an image like this, just to find out what data is here, is to go to the exposure compensation slider. And again, it doesn't matter what app you're using, the same thing. Go to exposure compensation and just drag it up or down just to see what data is there. And so as I pull this down, I'll pull it down really dark. We can see here that there is a huge amount of data in the sky, but I can see that I have clipped the highlights in these clouds right here. So I know that I'm never going to recover detail into that. That's just not going to happen. The data does not exist, but there is a huge amount of data throughout the clouds here in general. So that means that what I can do is get my exposure to a point where I do have a really good cloud. Now, unfortunately, if I get this down to the point where the clouds look really good like so, the rest of the scene has gotten really, really dark. So now it's really a case of finding the right combination of settings. And so what I'm going to do, let me just, hopefully I didn't do, I guess I'm going to have to start this over again. I should have saved that as a original setting. I'm going to make some adjustments to get this into the right space. So I'll start by bringing the exposure down a little bit. I'm watching the foreground here as well as the background of the sky. And then it's going to be a case of just playing with different adjustments. Maybe I'll bring my highlights down a bit. And there we can see that's pretty good, actually. We're bringing quite a bit down into there. Maybe I want to do a little bit of smart lighting. Let's see what happens if I bring this up. And that's getting pretty good. We're getting a little bit more happening in there with the smart lighting being dragged up. We can see it's getting more of the data in there. I could probably bring the exposure back up a little bit now, make it a little bit less bright, a little bit less dark. Yeah, we're getting somewhere. So at this point, I'm going to take my black point down just a tiny bit. The image looks a lot better in the sense that I have a lot more detail in here. It doesn't have the contrast and the punch that I might want out of this. But if you look at the histogram, we can see that I am sending a very good set of data to my host, to my plugin. In fact, I could probably let's bring up the highlights a little bit more. I'm watching the histogram very carefully here. I know that I've got clipped data in here, so I'm not going to worry about that. But I do want to send as full of a range of data as possible. So I think we're going to start with this. This is a pretty good base beginning point. Now, if I was going to continue editing this in color, I would certainly do a lot more to the image here inside of PhotoLab, but I'm not. In this case, I am going to take this off to Silver Efex Pro, and I think that I will, from there, be adding some contrast and so on. I think I'm going to straighten this out a little bit as well. This horizon line is feeling a little bit crooked to me. Let's just drag that down. Let's see what that looks like. I'm going the wrong way there. Do I want to go this way? Maybe I want to go that way. So you can do the horizon line if you have a clean line by just adjusting this line. Although this case, it might not be the right way to do it. So what we can also do is look for the horizon tool, which I don't remember where it is. So I'm going to go up here and type in horizon. There it is. And then I can take the slider here and just adjust it that way. So you can go either way. I think that's looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and close that. And we're going to call that good enough. All right, let's take this thing off to the Nik Collection. So to do that, I'm going to click on the Nik Collection button down here. Now, when I click on this, before I go into the plugin, I do want to check my settings. And I want to make sure, and this is going to be set up by default, probably the way you want it. Looks like I've been playing around in here and it's not set up the way that I want it. So by default, it should be set to export as TIFF. I really would never recommend exporting as a JPEG. Just, you're losing a lot of editing possibility in here, so kind of don't. Exporting as TIFF is what we want. You can also export selected files without processing, which means it'll take whatever you have here and send it to the Nik Collection. But in this case, since it's a raw file, that actually won't work. If it was already a TIFF, then that would work just fine. But in this case, I want to export as a TIFF, which means all of this work that I've done will get rendered out and into that TIFF file and sent off there. I almost always want to use a 16-bit file. 16 bits just going to give me a little bit more room to work with, especially when working in color. Now, in black and white, it's debatable whether you really need that or not. I'm going to do it because disk storage space is cheap and I don't want to limit myself in any way, so I'm just going to go for 16-bit. Well, we're definitely not resizing the image, so we can leave that alone. We're not adding a watermark, and the ICC profile can stay as it's shot, so that's fine. So basically, by default, it probably will be this way: TIFF, 16-bit, everything else is off, and we're good to go. And then I just click on the plugin that I want, in this case, Silver Efex Pro. So the software will render out that TIFF file for me and open her up in Silver Efex Pro. And from here, we're going to take a look at some of the new UI. We'll just get a little tour in here of what we're looking at, and I'll take you through the interface a bit. So on the left hand, the layout, if you're familiar with this from before, the layout is very much the same. The presets are all over here on the left-hand side. We have our basic tools on the top, and then on the right, we have all of our adjustments. And so this itself hasn't changed. However, just the overall look and feel of it has changed. The buttons have changed. The new color scheme, this new darker UI, easier to read. It's totally designed for Retina screens. It just looks really, really nice and clean. If you ever want to give yourself a little bit more screen real estate, you can collapse any one of these palettes. So if you don't need your presets, you can collapse that, give yourself a little bit more room to work in here. And you can do that with the adjustments as well, but obviously you're probably going to want to keep that open while you're working. But you have that capability. Up at the top, you've got compare, which right now, let's see here, let me open up the presets again. I'm just going to grab the first preset here and add that. So now if I hold down the compare button, we get a little before and after, but I can also click on this one to do a split screen, and this will allow me to reposition the split wherever I want. And I can also click on this little double-headed arrows here to flip that screen to rotate it. So if I want to have it a different angle, I can do it that way, top to bottom or left, right. And then this before and after will allow me to see the two of them side by side. And again, I can click this button to swap between those and reposition it. So generally, for the most part, I am in this mode and I will hold down the compare button when I want to compare, but certainly sometimes it's very handy to be able to have that split or that side by side view. Totally up to you how you want to work. And then you get your zoom buttons. So there's fit is what it's set to right now. There's fill, which, is just going to fill in the gaps. In this case, it doesn't make much of a difference. So this would make a bigger difference if it was a vertical picture. Then we can do a one-to-one zoom. And you see it zooms in one-to-one. We have our navigator up here on the top right to reposition what part of the scene we're looking at. And then this other button to the right here, right now it says 2-to-1, but if I drop this down, you can change what that shows. So do I want to go into a 2-to-1 zoom? Do I want to go into 1-to-2 zooms? We're looking at a half size or whatever the case may be. Generally, you're going to want to toggle back and forth between the fit, so you can see the whole thing, and 1-to-1. And I want to point out that going to 1-to-1 is pretty important, especially if you're doing anything with grain, because when you're, or sharpening, grain or sharpening are two areas you really want to be careful about what you're doing to the image. So you should always zoom into 1-to-1 to get a true understanding of what you're looking at. The reason for that is pretty simple. Let's just think about grain as the easier one to kind of visualize. If you have an area, just whatever, it doesn't matter the size, you have an area this big and it's got a bunch of grain pixels in it. When you zoom out of the image, you're not looking at that whole image. You are looking at, let's say you zoom out from this to half size. Well, you're now looking at 1/4 of that space. You're looking at 1/4 of the pixels, which means while the grain will be representative of what you would see at that size, it's not a true definition, the right word. It's not a true view of the grain and how it's going to look against the image. To see that, you really have to zoom into 1-to-1, so you're seeing every little dot of grain, because a lot of those dots of grain obviously, are subpixel. They're very, very, very small, and when you're looking at it zoomed out, they simply may not show up, just because that's how computers draw things, right? We're looking at a pixel-based monitor and a pixel-based image, and when you zoom out, all you can do is hide some of those or interpolate and make up a new pixel where there used to be 4, kind of make it into 1 type of a thing, and it's all sub-pixel interpolation, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that you're not seeing the true image. So when it comes to things like sharpening and grain, you want to see it, you want to see the true image, so you should always zoom into 1-to-1. So just throwing that out there now. Okay, so with that said, there's your zooms, and then over on the right-hand side, we have all of our controls. Here in Silver Efex Pro, you'll find there is what they call the loop at the top, which is a close-up view of wherever I'm positioning my mouse. What this also allows me to do is pin it. So I can say, show me, this part of the image here, and then that gets locked in, and I'm always looking at that part of the image no matter where I position the mouse. Click it again, and it pins off of there. You have the histogram underneath that, so we can see the histogram that looks similar to what we had out of PhotoLab. We can look at that as an RGB histogram, or look at the red, green, and blue channels individually. This right now, between these three, is all going to be the same because it's a totally monochromatic image. However, if we started getting into blending in parts of the color image in here, then that would change. Or adding something like a sepia shift to it, then that would change. Or you can just look at the luminance channel. Above the histogram are these little chiclets here, and these are really important. This is the zone system, and as I drag my mouse over these, you see that it is highlighting all the different zones of the image. Now, without getting into the zone system, as I alluded to earlier, because I've already done a huge webinar just on that, what I might do at some point is enable just the top zone, number 10, just to find out if I'm clipping anything at all. Now, in this particular image, we already know that we are clipping, or we have clipped the data in this part of the sky here, of the cloud rather. We're never going to recover that, but I also know that I probably don't want to push that anything other than this beyond that 10 or most brightest point of the scene. So that's something to keep in mind as we go. Let's go ahead back to neutral here, and you'll see that that is in fact striping, and that's fine because that is already at its maximum. But if, for example, I was to go into a global adjustment here and take the overall brightness up, let's just take this up a bunch, we can see that we could start to get to a point where we're clipping way more data, and we know that that is definitely not good. So we won't want to do that. Anyway, so these tools here are super handy for keeping an eye on your levels, whether you're talking about your darkest levels, your brightest levels, or anything else in the zone system. And again, whole other webinar, which I've already done, which I encourage you to watch. Okay, scrolling down from there, now we get into the adjustments. You got your global adjustments. So you have your brightness ones, brightness, highlight, midtone, and shadows, and then dynamic brightness, contrast adjustments in here, structure, which is always a really fun one to do with black and white, tonality protection, individual shadows and highlights controls here. And then we get into selective adjustments, the control points, where of course we will be spending some time. You have your ClearView slider. This is the one that I alluded to earlier as part of the slides. This is built into PhotoLab itself. This is taken out of PhotoLab and dropped here into Silver Efex Pro. And when we come to that part of the demo, we'll be looking at that. And then you have color filters in here. Just like shooting black and white film, you can add a color filter over your image and get a very different look to it. We'll be exploring that with another photo today. And then we get into our film types and film grain. I'm going to collapse both of those for now, where we will be spending a bit of time later on as well. And then at the very bottom, you have your finishing adjustments that allow you to do some toning, some vignetting, adding borders, and so on. So lots and lots of stuff that we can do in here. And there is the kind of overall gist of it. So with all that shown, let's now jump over to the preset side and start taking a look at these. There are a ton of different presets in here that we can start with. You get a nice big thumbnail preview of what it's going to look like. So I can just preview it here. So there's what that one particular preset would look like. Go through these presets and not just think of the presets as a way to treat the entire image, but look at it as a way to look at a part of it. Like, oh man, the sky here is so cool. Okay, yes, the foreground is totally wrong, but man, that's a cool sky. Okay, keep that in mind. I might want to do something with that later on and so on. And you just keep on scrolling through and you find different ones. I have one here that I quite like. I'm gonna pull up called this grad ND. It's preset number 14. So it's a graduated neutral density. That's what the grad means. It has an EV -2, meaning it's an exposure shift, essentially of 2 stops under. And this is looking pretty darn good. I kind of like this a lot, except that the center mountain here, if you will, or hill, or whatever we want to call that, is a bit too dark. So I'm going to brighten that up, and I'm going to use a control point for that. So now we're going to get into our first look at the control points. And the control points, if you're not familiar, they're once again here under selective adjustments. What a control point allows me to do is isolate a particular part of the image and edit just that part of it. And here's how it works. Grab a control point and drop it down here, and you get this round spherical shape. And at first glance, if you don't know anything about it, you might think of this as a simple radial gradient, but it's so much more than that. In fact, let me just turn on the mask view. And what we're seeing now is exactly what will be affected by this gradient, by this control point. It is, yes, it is a radial gradient in the sense that it's most intense here and it fades out. However, you can see by the mask that's been built in here that it is not just a radial gradient. It is actually building a mask in real time based off of the chrominance, that's the color, and the luminance, that's the brightness, of the underlying image. And yes, this is looking at the color of the original source image, since this one's black and white, And we know that because if I go down here to the new color selectivity sliders, I have luminance sliders and chrominance sliders that will allow me to change the mask based off of the brightness and the colors of the original selected pixel. So just to kind of reiterate, in case you're unfamiliar with this, wherever I drop this center point is the basis for the entire mask. And let's just bring it up to the sky to make it perhaps a little bit easier to follow. If I go into, let's say, this part of the cloud up here, we can see that whatever is white, again, we're looking at the mask view here, whatever is white is the most, is where the filter is going to be applied the most. Let's say 100% if it's pure white. Anywhere that's black, the filter will be applied, or the effect, I should say, will be applied 0%. And anything that's gray will be a shade of that in between. So the lighter the color of the mask, the more whatever I am about to do will be applied. The darker it is, the less it'll be applied. And so as I'm deciding what part of the image I want to affect, I move this around to select that part of the image. But if I want to refine that, now new to Nik Collection 4, I can. So I can say, you know what, if I adjust the luminance slider, it's going to say restrict that mask based off of the luminance. The more I drag this to the right, the more restrictive that mask is going to be based off of the brightness. The more I drag it to the right, the more that mask is going to be restricted based off of the color. And again, the color of the original source, because obviously we're not looking at a color image here, right? We're looking at it in black and white. This is now a black and white photo, but based off the original color source, it will create that mask. And so in this image, perhaps this was a slightly different shade of green than this was over here. So I'm able to restrict that down to do that. Now I can also go the other way and expand this out to get to a point where if I set them both to 0%, now we do have a good old-fashioned simple radial gradient, which is actually a really big deal. If you are a user of the Nik Collection in years past, then this is something you were never able to do before. I mean, you never had this control either, but sometimes you just want a simple radial gradient, and now you have it, which is awesome. But in this case, that's not what I want. I want to kind of refine this over the mountain itself, maybe a little bit of the water, but I definitely don't want to get into the sky. And so I'm going to adjust my mask, let's say right about there. Let's see how that works, and turn off the mask view and then make some changes. And in this case, I'll just take the brightness up a little bit just to brighten up that center part of the hill there. And again, if I wanted to, even now that I've made this change, in fact, let's make that a little bit brighter, I can still go in here and change the mask. I don't have to look at the mask to change it, and I can drag this back and forth to see how that's going to affect the image, which can obviously be very helpful to help you dial in the image effect the way that you want it. So I think that's pretty good right there. I've brightened that up nicely, and let's just call that done. That's the effect of what I wanted to do to this image. I started with a simple black and white. I added a single preset, which did a lot of stuff to it. If we want to know what it did, we can go into the global adjustments here and start scrolling through and seeing what it did. It's what has it done in here? Oh, here we go. It's done some color. No, that's the selective adjustments. What has it done? Maybe nothing up there. Maybe it's all down here in film types, color filters, and film types. I guess that's where all the work has been done here. Yep, we can see this big old curve that's been added and so on. Maybe some finishing adjustments done in here, and all of this, of course, was added by the preset. But I don't care. All I know is that I added it, I like it, and I just wanted to brighten up the center. So cool. All right, let's go ahead and apply this effect to this image, and then we'll move on to another photo. But before I do that, I'm going to answer a couple of questions that have popped up. Where can you show, Kent is asking, where can you show clipped shadows and highlights in PhotoLab? That is right up here. Under the histogram in PhotoLab, you have a little moon and a little sun, and this shows you your clipped highlights. So let's go back to our base image. And if I take my exposure way up, there we're starting to see the clipped highlights. And if I go down the other way, there we see the clipped shadows. So that is how that is represented inside of PhotoLab itself. Right there, turn these on and off. Thank you for that question. Second question, should grain be done at the end of the editing process? That's a really, really good question. I think it depends on what you're doing. I would say if you're doing any kind of retouching, absolutely do your retouching before you apply grain. Because if you, let's say you're doing some cloning, right? Removing spots on a face or birds out of the sky, whatever. If you do that retouching after you've added grain, then the grain pattern itself is going to be either cloned or healed, and quite often, especially if you're using a healing tool, the healing tool might interpret the grain as something to be removed, and so that's not going to look good. So any kind of retouching I would absolutely do before adding your grain. Now, and if you were doing retouching here, you would actually do it in PhotoLab. And in fact, this is the next photo. I think the next photo, yeah, the next photo I use has some retouching already done to it here in PhotoLab. So I'll show you that. And that's super important to do that before sending it off to whatever filter you're doing, whatever filter you're going to use. So retouching, absolutely. When you're in PhotoLab, it doesn't, when you're in Silver Efex Pro, it doesn't matter when you add the grain because everything that's in there is re-rendered together. It's if I add grain, adjust the grain sliders, and then I go up and adjust the exposure slider, it is not adjusting the grain kind of after it was applied. Everything is recalculated from the top to the bottom every time you adjust a slider. And so an easy way to think of that is if I take highlights, if I take the brightness up and then I take the highlights down, the difference is going to be calculated, right? So if brightness went up, let's say +1, but then highlights were pulled down -1, it doesn't mean that the highlights were pushed up 1 and then pulled back down 1, which would look bad. That would be kind of destruction of the pixels. The highlights will then be calculated as a 0 adjustment because it's the +1, -1. However, the midtones and shadows would still be that +1 from the main exposure slider. That's essentially how that goes. So it doesn't matter when you do the grain inside of Silver Efex Pro. If you know you want to apply grain, then you might want to do that earlier in the process, just so that you can get a feel of how it looks, because it will change the overall look of the image. And then as you're adjusting your shadows and highlights and whatever you're doing, you might go, ooh, the grain's a little bit too much, or I've lost a little bit of it, want to add a little bit more. And so you can adjust it then, but you can go back and forth as many times as you want. You're not going to damage anything. Last question for now, ClearView. Does ClearView equal dehaze in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom? It is the same concept, but it is a different algorithm. It is DxO's own algorithm, whereas what Adobe has in theirs is their own algorithm. And I think it will be pretty apparent. Do I have a really good demo image for this? I don't have a really strong image for this here, but you can see in some of the webinars I've done past where I've used ClearView on some really, really foggy, hazy images. The end result of ClearView, I believe, is superior to what you get out of those other filters. And I encourage you to try it for yourself. And by all means, there may be a photo that just looks better in dehaze than it does with ClearView. But the thing with dehaze is once you take it, if you take it up really high, the image looks like it's been altered. You can kind of tell that it's been altered. Whereas with PhotoLab's ClearView, I feel that you can take it all the way up to 100 and it doesn't look fake. It has a much more realistic look to it. It's just a different algorithm. Same idea, different algorithm. Much like raw decoding. Raw decoding in PhotoLab or Photoshop or Apple Photos, it's all the same idea. It's raw decoding, but they all have their own unique recipe, their own unique algorithm that will give you a slightly different look. So, and sometimes it's personal preference and sometimes one's just better than the other. So there you go. Okay, with that, let's move on to the next image. Alrighty, second image is, where is she? There it is. Nope, there it is, last one. That's there we go, there's the photo there. Okay, so this is my starting point. I'm not gonna do a whole lot to change this image, or actually I'm not gonna do anything to change it, but I'm not going to do any additional changes. Have I done anything other than retouching? Let's just see here. I'll look at things that have been applied. A little smart lighting, most of this is applied by default in here. So no, I don't think there's anything in here that I've applied except for the repairing. So let me just toggle that off, and you can see that there's all this garbage on the hills, unfortunately. This was in Vietnam. These sand dunes in Vietnam, absolutely beautiful, but sadly, all this garbage on there, so I went in and got rid of that. Now I've hidden my adjustments. Let's go back to here, and there's my repair, turn my repair back on, and there it is. So that's all done within PhotoLab itself. So that's all nicely cleaned up. Maybe I could have done a little bit more, but it's fine for now. And I'm going to send this one off to Silver Efex Pro. So click the Nik Collection button. My settings I know are already fine, so I just click on Silver Efex Pro and off we go. And from here, I am going to enable that zebra striping on the top one, on number 10 here, just so I can keep an eye on my highlight areas and make sure I don't blow anything out. We could already see a little bit of striping over here, but this is a tiny mountain, a bright spot of the sky, so I'm not going to worry about that. But I want to make sure that I don't bring too much else, if anything else, up into that stage. So now, let's see here. I feel like this image needs to be brighter. It's a little bit on the dark side in here. If we look at the histogram, I mean, there's there's a good amount of bright stuff in here, but it just doesn't feel bright. So let's just try it. Let's just take the brightness slider and bring that up. And you know, it's getting brighter. I mean, it's okay. Maybe I would do that and then take my shadows down, get some contrast back in there, maybe hold the midtones down, and you know, it's an approach. And you might fiddle around with this and come up with an approach, a result that you like, and that's just definitely one way to go about it. You go in and amplify whites and blacks, and you know, maybe I find that correct view of the image that I think looks really, really great. So that's one way to do it. But there's something else that I want to play with. I'm going to reset all those. I want to play with, I'm going to keep hiding things that I'm not using just to make this UI a little bit easier to follow. I'm going to open color filters. Now, color filters, if you are not familiar with, the idea behind a color filter is, this goes back to the days of black and white film, where you would take literally a colored piece of glass, blue, yellow, red, put it over the camera, and looking through the camera, you now see the world as red or as blue. And you know, obviously, if it was a color photo, it would look awful. But we're not shooting color, we're shooting black and white. And what happens is that color filter absorbs that color coming through the lens. And so a red filter absorbs the red light, meaning that less of the red light gets passed through. And so there's less exposure for the red light. So anything that's red in the scene would get brighter. So blue, it would be a common filter color to use. You put a blue filter on, and that makes your blue sky look really dark because it absorbs that blue light. Pretty cool, right? Well, now we can simulate that here in software, which is super awesome. So I'm going to go over here and I am going to just kind of cycle through these. So for example, if I click on the blue here, or I click on the yellow, or I click on the red, we can just kind of try them out and see what's going to look good and cool. And I think in this case, the red actually does a really neat job of brightening up the sand dunes in here. So now let's take the strength of that and increase that a little bit. Try that, drag that up a little bit there. And we can get this really cool, bright looking sand dune in there that if I just do a quick little before and after, suddenly looks really, really dynamic and awesome. I love it. So that's awesome. Digging this. It's just way better than playing with the brightness and the highlights and shadows and so on. I think the end result of this was really, really cool. And let's see where else we can take it. So maybe I want to add a little bit more contrast into the overall scene. So now let's go back to my global adjustments and let's try the contrast slider. I'll take this up. Take this, and it's too much. It's just, I like the kind of the direction it's going, but it's a little bit too much. So I got amplify whites, which is kind of contrast in the whites or contrast in the blacks. It's kind of interesting. But there's this other one here called soft contrast. What's that going to do? Let's try that one. And I drag that up or down, and actually going negative soft contrast looks kind of cool. I kind of like the way that looks actually. So hold on a second, what is soft contrast? Well, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked. If you find something you don't know what it is, there is a wonderful help system built into this. I'm just going to open up the user guide, and that is going to open a browser in another window, which I will now drag over here. Here we go. Open up the user guide, and this is instead of a PDF, it's this kind of searchable, linkable user guide in here. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to search for answers, and I'm going to search for soft contrast. And look through these. It's got a few settings in here, a few entries for it. But it looks like here, so this one's for Silver Efex, this one's for Silver Efex presets, Viveza presets. But here's one under correction tools, under Silver Efex tools, and then this will tell me what that is. Scroll down, and here we go, soft contrast. The purpose of the slider is to provide a different approach to contrast, less harsh, and with much more diffused transitions. Fascinating. I only do this to make the point that there's a lot going on inside of any of these plugins, but especially Silver Efex Pro. If you see something and you don't know what it is, this is a great way to understand it. Go into that help system, pull up the manual here, and just search for it, or dig through the manual and figure out how things work. There's a lot of information in here, and a great way to learn about what some of these tools can do or what they're meant to do. Sometimes you just drag a slider and you go, okay, I like that, and cool. But sometimes you want to know a little bit more about it, and this is a great way to figure that out. So cool on that. It's definitely something to check out. Okay, so with that done, let's go ahead and I think actually, man, that's pretty darn cool. I think I'm probably gonna leave that. Maybe I want to bring up my blacks just a little bit at this point, amplify the blacks. Actually, no, I don't. I think I just dig that the way it is. I like it. So there we go. So there is that version of the image. I'm happy with that. I like the way it looks. Let's do a little compare here from where we started to where we are now, and that is pretty slick in here. Now I see a question before I hit OK. I see a question's come up from Bob saying Silver Efex compare. Any way to compare two different presets? not as a split screen. You would just have to click back and forth between them. So there's no, the split screen preview will only show you versus the original, not a way to compare two presets. So you just have to click back and forth between them. Now, kind of a shortcut way to do that would be, let's do this. I'm gonna go ahead and just reset this image. Just reset everything on here. And actually, it doesn't matter if I reset because these, here, I'll use this neutral one to do a full reset. Let's say that I want to compare between full contrast and structure and something farther down the list. So what I'll do is I will mark this as a favorite using the star. And then let's say I want to compare that to, let's go down here, film noir. We're going to do something really obviously different. And I'll select that. Let's turn off the clipping in there. And now I want to go back and forth between them quickly, but I don't just scroll back up and find it. So now I'll go to my favorites, filter by favorites, and now I can toggle back and forth like this. And because it's already been loaded, it's cached, and so it loads up virtually instantly. So no, there's not a toggle, and there is no split screen view of it, but this does let me toggle back and forth between them. I could do a split screen like this, split screen to the original, but I can't do a split between the two, but it does allow me to toggle between the two very, very quickly. So that's how I would go about doing that. All right, now that I've lost my beautiful image that I had worked on, I guess I'll just cancel this. And we will move on to the next photo. Let's close that browser window and let's see here. The next photo is, here we go, this one here. This is in Hawaii. And if any of you have watched some of my videos before, you might have seen this image come up. I absolutely love using this image for demos because it just works really well. This is a very demonstratable image. I love it. So with this photo, there's a few things that I can do. Let's first, actually, let me just do it. I should have done a reset. Pretend I didn't show you that version. Here's the original. Reset that photo back to where we started. So much like that photo that we started with, the horseshoe bend photo, that was the water, wherever it went. This one down here, much like that, the image appears to be overexposed to begin with. And if I go into my basic adjustments and I pull my exposure down, I can see what is in the sky. There's actually a whole lot left into there. Bit of clipping up in this spot, bit of clipping here. But for the most part, there is a lot of detail in there that we can work with. So I want to work on this image. So let's see here. I'm just going to start playing with it. I'm going to do a little bit of an exposure drop here. Let's take it down to, let's say, right about there. That sounds pretty good. On my highlights, now I don't want to bring the exposure down too much because I don't want this to get really dark, but my highlights are still too blown out. So let's go to selective toning and let's see if I can pull down just the highlights. We'll do that. There we go. There we're getting a lot more into the sky in there. And again, I know that I have some clipping up here, so I don't want to go so much that clipping becomes apparent. I want to make sure that my transition from the brightest spots into the clipped areas is smooth and clean, so we don't see the clipping. So that's good, looking pretty good there. Let's see, I want to make a little bit more contrast here. Maybe pull my blacks down a little bit darker. Now, if I go too far, we see that this gets really crunchy down here very quickly. So I'm going to want to keep an eye on that. Let's say maybe right about there. Yeah, I think that's looking pretty good there. Still might be a little bit on the dark side, but I think we're pretty good there. Yeah, I think that'll work. And I want a little bit more to the sky, but if I just keep playing with the highlights, it's just going to kind of pull down the highlights everywhere too much, right? If I keep pulling down the highlights, it gets too much everywhere. So let's put this back about where it was. And instead, I'm going to use local adjustments because let's not forget that within PhotoLab itself, we do have our own control points in here that we can use. So for example, maybe I want to take this brightest part of the sky and darken that just a little bit. Let's pull the highlights down a little bit in here. Maybe overall make this a little bit darker. And of course, if we want to, come here, there we go. If we want to see exactly what we're affecting, we can view the mask. So there we go. It's a nice clean mask. Now we don't have that same level of mask adjustment that we have inside of the Nik Collection because that's new to that, but I can still go in here and adjust the cloud. Actually, that looks pretty good, pulling the cloud overall exposure down a bit there, just to add a little bit more detail into that. I like that. And I'm also going to bring up the brightness a little bit down here in the bottom right corner. If I just add another control point here, then that is part of this selection. So changes that I make here are affecting both. I guess that was a bad example. Let's do this one. Changes that I make to this one are affecting both of those. So instead, what I need to do is, let's delete this one, hit the delete key, is I need to create a new mask so that I have a whole separate area of control. And then within that, I'll bring up that exposure a little bit. So now that looks pretty good. If I toggle my, my local adjustments on and off, we can see the difference there, and that is looking much better. So it's very similar to that Horseshoe River photo. Here, what we're looking at right now may feel a little bit on the flat side, but looking at the histogram, we see we've got all my data in range, and I will add some of this contrast back in when we get back into Silver Efex Pro. Now, the next thing I want to do with this, because this is clearly a bit of a hazy image, is the ClearView slider. And so now I'm going to show you that we can do this inside of PhotoLab itself, but then I'll talk about why we may not want to. So here's ClearView. Let's just turn it on with the intensity is already way up, and let me just drag it back down. You can see here as just take it all the way up to 100. It's a bit ridiculous, but wow, right? Just this incredible amount of contrast added in there, where the sky looks really wicked and crazy. It's a little bit much around the edge of the mountaintop here, but that is some pretty cool cutting through the haze. However, I don't want to do this in here because I may end up, once I'm in Silver Efex Pro, not wanting that much contrast, that much micro contrast that's made up of, that's what effectively does with ClearView is micro contrast. And I don't want to have to undo it. And so instead of doing it in here, I'm going to use Silver Efex Pro to do it because I know that it's in there. Now, if I didn't have micro contrast or I didn't have ClearView inside of the tool, then I would certainly do it here. But because I know that I've got it in Silver Efex Pro, I'm not going to. Also, this shows that if you're using a different host, say you were using Photoshop or Lightroom, then it might be better off, or you wouldn't have ClearView, and so you'd of course have to be doing that inside of Silver Efex Pro. So with that said, there's the ClearView, there's the ultimate effect of it, but I'm not going to do it here. I'm going to do this in Silver Efex, so I think it's time to go over there. Let's hit the Nik Collection button, jump into Silver Efex Pros, and wait for that to render out. Jump in there, and here we go. All right, so what are we going to do in here? Well, as always, there's a bunch of different previews. We could just kind of start running through these things, but let's just go straight into ClearView here in Silver Efex Pro, since we know that that's where we left off before. Here's my ClearView slider. Let's open that, and now I've got that slider in here to do that same kind of a look, but now I'm seeing exactly how it looks in Silver Efex Pro in black and white. And here's a really good example of why I didn't want to do this before. I'll take this way up. I'll take it all the way up to 100, like I had in PhotoLab itself. And in PhotoLab, well, yes, it was too much at this point. Let's not disagree. That was too much. Bringing it up here, though, look at how the image, even though we had this kind of really cool, in fact, I wonder if I can do this. Let me go back to PhotoLab. And yeah, here, because we have all these color separation, there's still this, even though it's crazy contrast in here, we have this nice separation of the different shades of green, and this looks okay. Let's ignore the fact that the sky is ridiculous, but this still looks pretty cool down here. However, as I go here, because we no longer have the color to be part of that separation, it starts to appear flat. Even though it's not flat, it's kind of this strange illusion where there's too much brightness and contrast in really small areas, and it just doesn't look good. And so we don't want to go that high with it. It's just too much. So we're going to want to find a compromise somewhere where it's going to look a little bit better. Had I done the effect here first and then brought it into Silver Efex, I wouldn't be able to really undo that, or if I tried undoing it, it wouldn't look anywhere near as good. So better off doing it later, keeping in mind that when you're working in color, what is acceptable for ClearView may be very different than what you're doing in black and white, which I think is really, really important. So, all right, let's find again a happy spot for that. Let's right about there. Now, it's still feeling a little bit on the flat side. And one of the cool things that I can do is selective changes. Of course, we've already seen that. But I want to do selective changes in a very precise and clinical way, if you will. There's these sunbeams that are coming down through the clouds in here. And those sunbeams are hitting the surface and could be brightening up the surface a little bit more than they are. So the way that I'm going to do that effect is using selective adjustments, control points. Now I'm going to drop a control point. Let's say I follow this sunbeam down and it's hitting right there. So I'll drop one right there. And let's make it really, really small. Let's actually zoom in to 100% on here. Actually, it might be too close. Let's zoom to let's do like a 1 to 2, half view in there. There we go. That's better. And let's move this over a little bit. And I want to brighten this up. If I was, let's say that I was not using the control points. Let's say that I was, or not using Silver Efex Pro. Let's say that I was doing this in Lightroom where all I have is a radial brightness adjustment here. So that would be the same as if, let's take a look at the mask, as if I had taken these sliders, bring them all the way down, and there's a simple radial radial adjustment, and now I go back into this and I say, all right, I'm going to brighten that spot up a little bit. So I take the brightness and I pull it up. That doesn't really look real, does it? I mean, it does not look like the sun is illuminating that spot because it's brightened up everything, regardless of the fact that some of this is in shadow. Some of these little tree areas, let's actually go to 1-to-1. Some of these little shadow areas are shadows because they're under bushes, under trees or whatever. And they shouldn't be brightened up, right? The sun would not be brightening that. So what I want to do is not have this radial gradient brighten the whole thing, because that just doesn't make sense. The physics don't do that. What I want to do is have it only brighten up the areas that are already brightened. And so I'm going to take my luminance adjustment and bring that up and say only affect the areas that are already bright. So basically saying make the brighter parts of the image brighter while leaving the darker parts of the image alone. So let's bring that mask to maybe right about there, and I'll go back and forth, maybe make some more adjustments to it. But now, as I've done that, let's bring up the brightness a little bit, actually just maybe a little bit too much on there. How about we bring up the amplify whites? That'll probably do a little bit more contrast. There we go. Maybe make this a little bit smaller in here, and maybe make the restricted area of what's being adjusted a little bit more strict, a little bit less. Point is, you get in here and you can really refine the areas of the image that are getting affected this way. So let's zoom back out, and I'm now going to duplicate this control point and add a couple more sunbeams. So I'll just hold down the Option key and drag this over. Let's see, one's hitting kind of right about there. We'll drop one onto that part of the hill and actually pull it down a little bit, like there-ish. I think that looks a little better. Maybe make that one a little bit smaller. And let's do one more over here. I'll take this and drag it over into the back there. And that's too much brightness there, so I'm going to pull that down. It wouldn't be quite that strong. And by doing this, we are adding these little splashes of light all over the place. Maybe that's still a little bit too much. Little splashes of light all over the place. And we're doing it in a way where we kind of toggle that on and off there, where we are, there, that's the view I wanted, where we are being able to add that in only on the parts of the image that were already lit and bring themselves a bit brighter. It's kind of a little bit overdone. I probably should dial those back a little bit more, but you get the idea. So this whole thing of the selective adjustments, the control points, with the ability to adjust exactly what part of the image is being affected is really just super, super awesome. Just a really, really cool part of it. So there's something you can do in there. That's really neat. All right, let's apply that. And there is one more question that's come up, so I'm going to jump over to the questions, and then we're going to go to our last image. Frank has said, will you be able to still do selective color in the control points with this Silver Efex Pro? Interesting. I never do selective color, but I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can. Okay, well, we'll check that out. Well, I'm sure you can, but we'll check it out when we get into the next image. No other questions up right now, so let's get into this. We're going to use this photo here. Actually, this would be a great photo to demo that. A selective color, assuming that is, I'm sure it's there, but we're going to find out. Okay, so this is the white sand, what is it called? White Sands, New Mexico. That's where this was. And it's a very kind of flattish image, if you will, which is going to be perfect for showing off film grain, which is where we're going to end today's presentation. So this image as it is perfectly fine. Not going to make any changes to it. Just take it into Silver Efex Pro, and I will answer Frank's question first once we get this back up and running. So he had asked about selective color with the control points. So let's see here. I'll add a control point to the green tree that was here. Let's make sure that we have the green tree selected. Yes, we do. Perfect. And scroll down and selective colorization. There it is. So let's bring some of that color back in. So there's selective colorization for the green. And actually, that's kind of a cool, actually a really good use of this. I'm glad you asked that. So let's take the chrominance of the range selection. If we can go the other way, bring that down so we're getting more. Basically, anything that is green in that range should be selected very nicely there. And I could play with the luminance one as well, although I probably don't need to. Actually, yeah, just bring that down a little bit. And there we go. So there you go. There's the answer to your question. Superb. Thank you for asking that. That was great. I had not tried that before. Okay, delete that. Let's play with film grain. So let me collapse all of these. I'm going to collapse all of this, give myself a little bit more space to work in here. And here we go. Film types and film grain. Now, this is going to be a bit interesting. If you have used Silver Efex Pro before, you might be thinking, well, hold on. Why is there two things? There's film types and film grains. I remember using Silver Efex Pro, and if I went into my film types and I chose a film type like, let's say, I'm going to pick something really nice and big and grainy in here. Let's go for Ilford Delta 3200 Pro. All right, so 3200 ISO film, and that is really grainy. So we zoom into 1:1 because remember, we want to look at this at 1:1 because we're looking at grain. And look at all that grain in there. So wait, there's grain. There's always been grain. So what did you add? I don't understand. Well, this grain that you're seeing as part of these film types is kind of a, come back here, is kind of a generic grain. It's grain per pixel size and hardness. That's it. These two sliders control all of the grain. In fact, if I double click to reset these, the grain disappears. There's no more grain. So here's what this tells us. This film type adjustment, calling these different film types like the Ilford Delta or the T-Max or whatever, is simulating the film by, forget about grain for a second, it's simulating the film by simulating the color responsiveness and the tonal response curve of that film. As I roll through these different presets in here, you can see behind the dropdown that the curve and the color values are changing. This is what this film type adjustment, this film type selector is doing. It is simulating film based off of its response curves to particular colors. That's what makes it look like a particular film type. And then on top of that, because all these different films have grain levels to them, I keep clicking the wrong thing and opening that, closing that, come back here, film types. There, grain. To simulate the grain, it has been a simple generic simulation of the amount of grain. Let's just say it that way, the amount of grain and the grain size, but not the actual grain pattern. Every single one of these different film types would have the same basic grain, just with different sizes and different hardnesses. So now what we have, let's go back into that 3200. Okay, 3200 Pro. All right, I'm going to turn this off for the moment. So we go back to our default image and collapse that. Now I go to film grain, and under film grain, I now have a dropdown that shows many of the same. And this is not a 100% one-for-one. There's a lot of overlap. However, you will find some grains that don't exist in film types and vice versa. But if we scroll through here, we will find the Ilford 3200. There it is, Delta 3200. And so now what we're looking at is a film grain that is mimicking actual Ilford Delta 3200, mimicking it because, as I said in the beginning, it is based off of a film scan. So this is designed to look just like that film grain actually did. So for the ultimate in film representation, what we want to do is combine both the film type and the film grain. So as I enable that film type again, we are now looking at a film type of this color response, but I want to reset my grain because I don't want to use the grain from here. Instead, I want to use the grain from this. And now I have that grain pattern that was there. And if I want a little bit more, I can change it. But I can take that intensity and I can make that a little bit more intense. Or if I want to change the grain size, you can do that as well. Now, why would you change the grain size? That seems like, well, hold on, grain size doesn't change. Well, remember, we're working with a digital image here, which you might want to be putting out a photo that is a little photo for social media that will need to have a larger grain size for that grain to be visible, as opposed to one that you're printing, which is going to be a completely different representation. So you're going to want to have a grain size that looks natural based off of that final print size. So there's a lot, and we're not going to get into that right now, but there's a lot to do as far as getting the right size, and often it may require doing test prints and so on. But for this case, if you know you're going to be doing a smaller version of the photo, you might want to increase the grain size. Or what you could do, and this could go back to the question that was asked earlier by, well, there was no name on there, but the person who asked earlier about should you do the grain at the end? Here's a good reason to do it at the very, very end, if you are doing a black and white image for Instagram, let's say. We know that Instagram is 1080 by 1350, 1350 tall, 1080 wide. There's your maximum size for Instagram. Maybe you do your black and white conversion without any of your grain, output that at that size, at 1350 by 1080, whatever, and then open that up and add grain on top of that at its 100%. So you're seeing it truly at the size that it will be. Because if I take this image we're looking at right now on screen and I export this out and then I scale it down to that smaller size, a lot of this grain might get lost. And so that's an approach that you might want to take if you want to kind of take it to that next level. Anyway, so with all that said, back in here, looking at these film grains, you'll see that we have a lot of different film grain patterns in here, and they all look quite different. These are all, again, mimicking real world films. So you can mix and match. You can be like, oh, I love the response curve of that 3200 Ilford, but I want the grain pattern of Kodak T-Max 400 because I just like the way that looks. and away you go. And that is totally up to you, something that you can do, which is pretty darned cool. Let's go down here to where there's some shadows. We can see some difference in how it's getting added to the shadows in here versus the highlights. And that is just absolutely fantastic. So I absolutely adore that. So the best way, the way to get the most out of this is to go into your film types, choose a film type. Let's do another one. Let's do Kodak 400 T-Max Pro. There we go. So good old Kodak 400 T-Max, beautiful one. We can see the grain in here, but again, this is a mimicked grain. So we're going to a generic grain, I should say. We're going to reset that. And then let's go to film grain. And oh, look at that, it's selected it for us, Kodak T-Max 400, and away we go. Or no, I had already chosen it, and away we go. So that's how that works. Pretty exciting. It is really, really cool. This is what really allows you to get that final, really, really good look on the image. I love it. Okay, let's see. There is one more question that has come up, and then we're going to wrap this thing up. Dan asks, how do you compare a specific grain to another without scrolling, similar to presets, or can I designate grains as favorites and compare only? So you can't designate grains as favorites. What I would do, I think you'd have to build a whole preset for that. So let's do that real quick. So let's say, let's hide the camera. Let's say that I wanted to compare, I'm going to reset everything and go back to neutral to make sure we're fully reset. And then I will go to film types and we're going to choose one film type. Let's do something really dramatic here. ADOX Silver Max 21, that's pretty dramatic. And let's reset the grain on there. And then let's go down to my film grain and let's try two different ones. Let's go for this Formapan 100 and take the intensity way up. I want to actually, well, I don't like that one. Let's do something else. Let's do that Delta 3200. We knew that was good. We'll add that one in. I guess I should be at 100%, shouldn't I? Follow my own rules in here. Okay, so we're gonna go with that one. Now I'll save that as a preset. And what was the film type? No, I forgot. What did I choose? I chose Silver Max. So we're going to call this Silver Max plus Silver Max plus Delta Ilford, good grief, Ilford Delta 3200. We don't have any control points, so I'll just disable that. We'll save that. And then I'll do another, something totally different. Let's compare it to T-Max. T-Max 3200, that's a good comparison. Kodak T-Max 3200. And again, I'll take the intensity way up and say I decide I like that. And now I'll save that. What was this called again? Silver Max. My brain is totally failing me. So we'll call this Silver Max plus T-Max. Good enough. Okay, 3200. Why not? All right, and save that. So now I've got those set. Now we'll go to my presets. I go to, where's my presets? All classic modern. Oh, custom presets, sorry. Go down to my custom presets. And here's those two. And so now I can toggle back and forth between those two. So that would be the way that I would do that. So you would have to save them as custom presets. So not quite as easy as just starring the favorites, but this is this is how I do it. So there you go. All righty. I think that's it. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in today. Thanks for the awesome questions. There's always happy to get good questions in here. And I'll see you again in 2 or 3 weeks, whenever that next one is. Take care.